Hello! Today, we are concluding the conversation with Gleb Nosovsky about the beliefs of the Great Empire. You can explore this topic visually at the New Chronology Multimedia Museum in Yaroslavl. The extensive museum exhibition consists of 14 thematic halls spread across 3 floors. The history of the Great Empire is presented here chronologically, starting from the birth of the first state in the Nile Valley to the period of the empire's final dissolution in the 18th century. Given the size of the exhibition, visitors can explore the museum in one visit or make multiple visits. The ticket to the New Chronology Multimedia Museum is also valid on the following day after the purchase. Hello, Gleb Vladimirovich.
Hello, Svetlana. I'm glad to meet you.
Gleb Vladimirovich, in our previous conversation, you talked about the natural scientific school that was established within the Apostolic Church by Sergius of Radonesh, which caused fear among his opponents. After the deaths of Dmitry Donskoy and Sergius of Radonesh, this scientific school was essentially destroyed. Please tell us how events unfolded from there.
Once Sergius' teachings were dismantled, his monasteries were reformed, and different individuals entered the church and universities. They pushed natural sciences aside, drove them into a corner. Scholasticism took the forefront. They attempted to turn theology into a science. And besides, as people far from natural sciences, what did they do? They concocted a theory about the end of the world in the year 7000. Now I will talk a bit about this. It's also a very important point. What was the dating system? The dating system was old and consisted of 3 cycles. Solar cycle from 1 to 28, lunar cycle from 1 to 19, and indiction from 1 to 15. Lunar cycle is the Metonic cycle. It has a purely astronomical calendar nature. I won't delve into its origin now. It's an astronomical calendar measure, a 19-year cycle. Solar cycle is purely a calendar cycle. The Julian calendar repeats itself every 28 years. Let's consider the calendar, which specifies the days of the week, months, and dates, that wall calendar we sometimes have. If you take it 28 years later, it will be exactly the same. It might be the same even before 28 years, but after 28 years, it will always be the same. That's a period. If it's currently the year 2021 and you add 28, in the year 2049, the calendar will be exactly the same as today. It might be earlier, but these periods are not constant. The smallest period, after which any calendar repeats, is 28 years. Hence, solar cycle. Indiction is not related to astronomy or calendars at all. This cycle somehow emerged from different considerations elsewhere. It doesn't matter how, but 3 cycles were established. Each year was represented by 3 numbers. For example, solar cycle 25, lunar cycle 18, and indiction 3. In the next year, solar cycle 26, lunar cycle 19, and indiction 4. We increment by 1. Moving on, again by 1, is 27, but here, we reach the limit at 19. So, we reset to 1. Here, it's 5. And further, we reach 28 here, and increment by 1. Done. We've reached 28. You see? 28 is the limit, reset to 1. These three counters rotate, and each year is denoted by three small numbers. The combinations of these three numbers repeat approximately every 8,000 years due to the fact that the numbers 28, 19, and 15 are mutually prime. Therefore, this combination repeats approximately every 8,000 years. Multiply 28 by 19 and by 15, and you get the period after which this trio repeats. This dating system satisfied everyone because it had triple reliability. At that time there were no printed books. Handwriting was not very clear. Some letters were hard to discern, and numbers were written out using letters. For instance, if the number of solar cycle was smudged and poorly read, but if we know that a certain year occurred a few years before today, the other two numbers can help us identify that year. It has built-in triple reliability when it comes to chronology of close events. But if we don't know which trio we're dealing with, for example, that year, without calculations, we can't even understand what year it is.
Was it in the past or will it be in the future?
Which year is it? Let's take some two trios, not simple ones where you can see one follows the other, forming a continuous sequence, but random numbers. Different numbers within certain limits. Without calculations that can't be formulated, you have to compare these trios through consecutive count. You can't even say which year comes before or after. You also can't say the difference between them, how many years have passed from one to the other. It's all consecutive count calculations. In essence, this system of dating was very useful for day-to-day life but was entirely unsuitable for chronology. If a person found an old book with such dates, they couldn't understand when those events took place. It's an old book, after all, and maybe some letters were written a bit differently. And if they started calculations, and there was only one date, and they misread it by even 1 unit, for example, in solar cycle, then their calculations would be off by a multiplication of 19 and 15. If they made an error by 1 unit in indiction, their calculations would be off by a multiplication of 19 and 28, which is over 500 years. This method of dating is such that it doesn't allow for small errors, but it easily allows for large errors. Why is it stable and small? That is, we can't make a huge error when we know that this date relates to our time. We can't be off by hundreds of years, so then we can't be off at all. That is, it doesn't allow for small errors. But if we don't know at all what this date relates to, then it allows for huge errors. It allows for errors of several hundred, even thousands of years, but it doesn't allow for errors in decades. By the way, I'll give an example of one of the dates. Here's an indiction date. Solar cycle 13, lunar cycle 10, indiction 15, on Sunday. Old dates look like this. From the old book, years from the creation of the world. This is indiction, this is solar cycle, and this is lunar cycle. Indiction, the third is solar cycle, and the fifth is lunar cycle. Such tables existed. For a while, people used this counting system and started digging through old books, trying to reconstruct chronology. It turned out that for historical reasons, it was completely unsuitable. Because of this, they got entangled in the old chronology. Were those wars in the 13th century or the 14th century? Ultimately, the apostolic Christians arrived, and people from the contemporary tradition came into power. They started investigating, dating things, writing history. When they encountered these dates, they immediately faced problems in the chronology. Realizing this, they decided to switch to the era-based system. The era-based system is what we use today. The era-based system was already being used by scholars at that time. In their works, in the Almagest, scholars used the era-based system.
They understood the drawbacks of the indiction system.
It was a societal dating, whereas scholars used the era-based system. And they decided that society needed to adopt the era-based system. But which era to choose? And then these guys, who expelled all the scholars and naturalists, and completely dominated the Christian Apostolic Church, came up with a brilliant idea from their perspective. Let's calculate what year was 111. So that solar cycle and lunar cycle are 1, and indiction is 1. Let's calculate this year, and let's use it as the starting point for counting. And this, presumably, was the year when God created the earth. That was their logic. How else could it be? There's no other way. So, they sat down and calculated. They toiled, they worked. The answer was found. Hypothetically speaking, they calculated that around the year 1400 or after the Battle of Kulikovo, for instance, around the year 1390. It turned out that the year 111 corresponded to 5507 BC, or minus 5508. Because years before the Common Era are shifted by 1. So, minus 5508, or 5507 BC. Consequently, in their time, around the year 1392, it was the year 6900. And how did the scholastic thought develop? God created the world in the year that was 6,900 years ago, as per their brilliant calculation. In this year, God created the world. The Bible states that He created it in 7 days. And the Apostle Peter said that 1 day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day. The Apostle Peter had such an expression. 1 day is with the Lord as 1,000 years. But the Apostle Peter said this in a comparative sense, to show that for God, our 1,000 years is like 1 day. It's a comparison. It doesn't mean he said it from a scientific standpoint. But these guys didn't understand the difference between science and mere words. They took everything literally. Since 1,000 years is with the Lord as 1 day, and if the Lord created the world in 7 days, then this world will exist for 7 days of the Lord. That's 7,000 years. They made such an ingenious revelation based on their calculations. If this is so, the world will exist for 7,000 years. And they were in the year 1392. That is, the year 6,900. Then there are only 100 years left until the end of the world. Because the year 7,000 would arrive in 1492. And since 100 years left, look how convenient it is. We could tell everyone to stop sinning, purify themselves, behave well, and prepare for the end of the world because the end of the world is coming soon. Not too soon that they would live to see it themselves. And yet, 100 years left. So, they confidently spoke about this without fearing that they would be wrong, because they understood that they wouldn't live another 100 years. On the other hand, it was still quite close.
Gleb Vladimirovich, what did the anticipation of the end of the world, which never came, lead to?
The period of calamities began. I've drawn the royal Christianity here with a thin blue line, which survived until the mid-17th century. That's the Russian paganism. After the Battle of Kulikovo, the royal Christians went to the Orient and gave rise to Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, and so on. But in Russia, to some extent, it persisted and existed until the mid-17th century. And from there comes all our paganism that neo-pagans like to recall now. Velez, Rod, Rusalka, Rusalia, Usen, there's much more. Of course, all this is forgotten, and what they recall isn't very clear on which sources it is based. We didn't research this, what exactly remained from it, but it's necessary to investigate. I believe there are many fantasies on this topic now, but it's a serious matter, and it would be good to seriously examine it. And here's the main state direction. Here's the apostolic Christianity. Somewhere around the beginning of the 15th century, disasters befell the empire. Firstly, there was an epidemic of the plague. What did they do? They created a vast empire and connected it with communication routes from China to England. The world was divided into two parts, East and West, just as it is divided today. They established the main market on the Volga River. The East worked as it does today. They immediately figured out how to arrange this scheme and did something similar. The East produced goods. The West mined silver because there are many silver mines in Western Europe. These two streams met on the Volga. Eastern caravans, coming from China through India, met Western merchants who sailed along the northern Dvina route. They met at the Mologa fair near Yaroslavl. 15% of the trade turnover between the East and the West was taken as a result of recoining Western silver into Russian kopecks. All of this was very well organized, but diseases started to spread along the caravan routes they created. Diseases, just like today and then, spread from the borders of China for various reasons. Particularly, due to the fact that people there consume a lot of things that we don't eat. Rats, cats, dogs, bats, and so on. These are all considered edible in those places, but not here. Accordingly, all these bacteria entered the human body. If before, some societies would die out there, and then others would come in their place. Now, due to the caravan routes, this spread across the entire empire. The outbreak expanded, and calamities began. It was a terrible plague, terrible epidemics, then cold spells started, and all of this combined led people into a state of utter hysteria. This was the beginning of the 15th century. There was no quarantine yet, no understanding of where all of this was coming from, and people were dying in entire cities. And then Muhammad appears, and a certain movement arises. By the way, this wasn't the same Islam that exists today. It would take on its present form later. At that time, it was still Orthodox Islam. It was an orthodoxy that was simultaneously Islam. It was a religion that combined elements of both orthodoxy and Islam. It was a Christian faith, but Muhammad was considered a great prophet by them. and Ali was a great prophet. And so, Muhammad appeared. In Russian history, he was the fugitive Golden Horde Khan, Ullah Muhammad. He founded Kazan around the year 1430 and opposed the ruling power of the empire at the time. He created his movement, the idea of which was that in the year 1492, which was already soon, in approximately 70 years, the end of the world was expected. He created this movement and gathered mainly Russian monastery monks under his banner. These were the Janissaries, from the word monks in Russian. Although historians today explain this word differently. He formed fanatical troops. What was their fanaticism? Their fanaticism was based on the belief that the end of the world would happen soon. And he wrote the Quran. By the way, the Quran is a brilliant book if you read it carefully. Its meaning is greatly obscured by the way it's currently translated and interpreted, although Muhammad constantly emphasizes that, "I wrote a very clear and understandable book." And it's indeed clear and understandable if you read it carefully. Unfortunately, reading it in Russian translation is quite difficult because the translation was made from Arabic interpretation, precisely from the modern Arabic interpretation of the Quran. The interpretation of the Quran needs to be changed. That is, it needs to be read differently in Arabic. The Arabic language has the peculiarity that one word can have multiple meanings, and so, it's very easy to confuse and interpret the text. Without changing a single word, you can interpret the text in such a way that, even though it won't change the topic, if it was clear before, it will become murky. It's as if instead of clear glass, you have cloudy glass. That's what's been done with the Quran today. In reality, the Quran is essentially dedicated to one idea, that the end of the world will come soon, when the sky will fold, mountains will burn, the sea will boil, everything will be burned, and all the dead will rise and stand before the judgment of God. And the goal is to prepare for the end of the world. Therefore, there's no need to spare anything, no need to spare your life, and God expects us to prepare for this correctly. So, even if sinners and unjust people have built something, created something, it still needs to be burnt, destroyed, purified, to cleanse the earth of all sinners, and wait. Anyway, everyone will perish soon. Therefore, it doesn't matter whether you enter paradise sooner or later. In fact, this idea still exists a bit in Islam. There's suicide murderers enter paradise. Now they can't drink, can't eat that, can't do this, but once they enter paradise, everything is allowed. Paradise is described very vividly in the Quran. I won't get into that, but it's described vividly. This idea was further combined with the fact that Muhammad was closely connected with scientific circles and had access to Damascus steel, which can cut ordinary iron. And these fanatical troops, armed with Damascus steel and cannons that already existed at that time, eventually overturned the existing world order and destroyed all the power that was in place. They swept away that power and came to power themselves, first in Constantinople and then in Moscow. I skipped this, but you should know from our reconstruction that when Dmitry Donskoy adopts apostolic Christianity, He moves the capital from Vladimir, Russia to the Bosporus, closer to the place where Christ was crucified. However, it wasn't exactly that place. He builds the city of Constantinople. And from just 1380 to 1453, Byzantium flourishes. How long is that? A remarkable flourishing of Byzantium took place over about 70 years. Essentially, this city had only a 70-year history. In 1453, the Ottomans took Constantinople. Initially, they established Kazan, where the real Kaaba is located. And in 1453, after Muhammad's death but during the lifetime of Mehmed II, also known as the Conqueror, who later got quite confused with Muhammad in the annals, Constantinople was captured. After the capital Constantinople was taken, the same people, metaphorically speaking, the Ottomans, came to power in Moscow, although they were still Christians. It was a Christian Ottomanism, or Ottoman Christianity, if you will. They established a dual-seat global power structure from their two capitals, Moscow and Constantinople, which now became Istanbul. The previous rulers who were in Constantinople fled to the Vatican. And it's here that another split arises. This is the idea of the end of the world. If you read the Quran, it's quite clear that not everyone believed in it. In the Quran, he constantly talks about this day and divides people into those who believed and those who considered it false. Those who considered it false were bad people. And the good ones were those who believed. Essentially, what did they consider false? It's also explained very well in the Quran, and it's absolutely clear that it's about the end of the world. Muhammad conveys his conversations with those who considered it false that the end of the world will happen at such and such time. They say, "Where did you get this? You're insane. Our fathers didn't tell us about this. Where did you get this? It's nonsense." But Muhammad brilliantly plays on emotions in the Quran. That is, it's not a logical book. It's propagandistic, emotional. It resonates deeply with people, especially with ordinary people. In response to these objections, "Where did you get this? How did you get this? It's nonsense," he presents it as the words of his opponents and responds to them, saying, "But there will be the end of the world. How miserable you will be. How they will chase you into hell. How they will cast you into the fire. How you will suffer. How you will say, 'Why didn't we believe?' And how bad it will be for you." These are the kinds of arguments. But it's brilliantly written. It's exactly what a crowd needs to hear. Certainly, not everyone, but he managed to convince some fanatically inclined people, armed them with Damascus steel weapons, and created a striking force that swept away everything. This was the 15th century Ottoman conquest, Kazan, then Constantinople. And when the end of the world didn't happen in 1492, the Ottoman pressure began to decline. Yes, they tried to cover it up. That's when they obscured the Quran. They slightly reinterpreted it so that its clear meaning about the end of the world. It didn't disappear. It's still there, visible in any translation of the Quran, but it became faint. Many words were translated and interpreted differently. I'm saying that words in the Arabic language have many meanings. Different meaning was given to many words. In the end, a rather unclear text emerged. The overall picture is still visible, but it's blurry. They did this with the Quran, leaving it as a sacred book, but muddying its clear meaning that Muhammad had conveyed. The conquest continued but began to wane. It was a tumultuous rise, an unstoppable wave of Ottoman conquest in the 15th century that saw no obstacles and shattered everything. In the 16th century, in the beginning, they still had some momentum for about 50 years. But then everything started to decline, and decline.
Gleb Vladimirovich, according to the new chronology, in 1492, after the failed end of the world, modern Judaism emerged. Could you please explain how it happened that Judaism became not only a religious doctrine but also a closed community that performed specific functions within the empire?
The hysteria about the end of the world intensified. The closer it got, the stronger the fear. 15 years before the end of the world, before 1492, Dante wrote the Divine Comedy. We have the dating for that. The end of the world is described fairly calmly there. 6 years before the end of the world, the book of Revelation was written. This book was written with significantly deeper emotions. The fear begins to boil over. It is well known from history that both here and in Western Europe, people were deeply affected and anticipated the end of the world. People sold all their possessions, preparing for the end of the world. Many even resorted to suicide.
This was going on according to our Russian Byzantine era, 5508 BC.
If you look at it now, they will say, well, here in Europe, we counted time from a different era from the creation of the world. We had our own eras. I'll explain this now. Before that, they didn't have any other eras. That's why they expected the end of the world precisely in that year, not in some other year according to the eras they talk about today. Finally, when the end of the world didn't happen, confusion arose. First and foremost, confusion arose among the merchant class. Many had sold their possessions, stopped earning money, and prepared for the end, giving everything away. They had prepared for the end of the world, but it didn't happen. The merchant community was particularly upset because they felt deceived. They were promised the end of the world, but it didn't happen. And what did they start to do? Firstly, they tried to find some explanation. And they found an explanation by declaring that the calculations were incorrect. In reality, the triplet 111 needed to be calculated differently. To shift in diction, calculate differently. Shift solar cycle. Instead, there's the golden number. The same thing, but shifted. And to recalculate the year of creation so that the 7,000th year hasn't yet come. And then the Jewish era arises, which didn't begin 5,000 years before the Common Era, but 3,000-something years, I don't remember exactly, around 4,000. So, it turns out to be more than 1,000 years later. Accordingly, the 7,000th year jumps to the year 2500 to 2600. According to the Jewish era they devised, it hasn't even arrived yet. They invented several eras more. That is, the first thing they did was recalculate the era and claimed that the old calculation was incorrect. Furthermore, they said that your entire church was wrong, and your Christ was wrong. You were relying on words from the gospel, which said that soon, wait. It was written by these people. So, the people who were upset said that your church was wrong, and your Christ was wrong. Now everything will be different for us. Firstly, Christ hadn't existed yet, he will come later. So, the construct was left Christian but turned towards the future. This is modern Judaism. Christ didn't exist. That Christ existed, but he was erroneous. He was a false Christ, a bad one. The good Christ will come later. And then the golden age will come. They didn't take the name Jews for nothing. It was some kind of remnants of the royal Christianity, also known as Judaism. These were the ancient Jews who were relatives of Christ. They fully possessed everything and were gods. Everyone bowed before them. Consequently, the well-known Jewish theory emerged that we were gods, not exactly gods, but the chosen people, and everyone should worship us. So, essentially, they took the Christian construct and turned it towards the future. And they took the Judeo-royal Christian history, when the surrounding nations all served them. Because it began with the fact that when the royal Christians conquered the world, they tried to make those nations the same as them. They had an enormous number of women. They tried to propagate their offspring on earth. And when they succeeded, in the end, ordinary people became the same as them, and they expelled them. They themselves created a situation where they no longer remained gods, because they made the surrounding people the same as themselves. But until they did that, there was a huge gap between ordinary people and them. They lived on earth as gods, and everyone served them. Essentially, Judaism also played up this situation. That is, it didn't invent anything new. It took this Christian history and turned it towards the future, turning history into a dream. There was another interesting aspect related to Judaism. It was the time of the Ottoman Orthodoxy of the 16th century. The people who ruled the empire from Istanbul and Moscow needed treasurers. Their monetary system was based on gold and silver. They didn't print paper money. They didn't even have a proper mint. There was a small one, but it printed very little. There was free coinage. In other words, there were simply artisans who minted money. Money was the weight of gold and silver, so there was a great variety. But copper money was not accepted. They needed to maintain the functioning of this monetary system, which worked as the servant of war. In other words, money was paid to the soldiers, and they boozed away this money. Then this money had to be collected from them through various drinking and entertainment establishments and turned back into the treasury, and then it was paid out again. This was the circulation of gold and silver in nature. Everything else was secondary for them. They saw the main utility of money in supporting military activities. For this purpose, they needed a clan of people who would be untouchable, with whom others wouldn't marry and start families, and who would be isolated from the rest of society. And this clan could be entrusted with financial operations, their transportation, storage, distribution, and so on. They chose the Jews for this role. It wasn't as simple as I'm describing it now, and I'm skipping many details, but in essence, it was like this. Thus, the Jews transformed not just into a religious movement but due to their rejection of Christ, declaring that the Christ of that time was wrong. While others didn't reject him, they positioned themselves as untouchable, with whom one couldn't interact, enter into marriages, and so on. This turned out to be very convenient. After all, they were merchants, and they were untouchable, which made them treasurers. In the 16th century, the Jews were entrusted with such a role in the empire. In the 16th century, Ottoman Orthodoxy exists, and it was sort of dominant. There's Catholicism, which sits in the Vatican and prepares for rebellion. It also originated from Apostolic Christianity, but doesn't have an Ottoman component. Catholicism is Apostolic Christianity without the Ottoman component. Orthodoxy is Apostolic Christianity with the Ottoman component, which later in the 17th century split into Orthodoxy and Islam. Judaism exists, it's useful, it's utilized. Jewish communities are used as treasuries. In the Orient, branches of royal Christianity with the direct adoration of czars, emperors, and kings develop. Of course, this has evolved over time, but much has remained from ancient times. Therefore, all of this seems very ancient to us. Everything Oriental seems ancient. It traces its roots back to the Battle of Kulikovo. Here's the religious landscape that emerges from the new chronology. Let me reiterate that we are not discussing who prays to God correctly, who doesn't, or any theological conclusions. If we look at the history of any belief system, they will say that there were people who prayed incorrectly, and then we diverged from them, separated because we started praying correctly. This is what everyone says. Therefore, one should not think that from the perspective of any religious doctrine, the correct movement did not originally exist. First, there were some followers, then they deviated into heresy, and then we separated from them. This is how any history is structured. In Judaism as well, if you remember how they present it today, there were polytheists. Then Abraham realized that this was wrong and created the correct belief system. And in Orthodoxy as well, there were some incorrect followers. Then Christ came and showed us the correct way. And so with all the others. This is the idea behind any belief system. In conclusion, I want to emphasize a very important thing. Science and faith should not be confused. Today, these things are often intertwined. Sacred history, sacred historical dates, these are matters of science. Dates are a matter of calculation. They can be calculated correctly or incorrectly. Dates of sacred history were all calculated. The date of the birth of Christ was calculated by Denis the Small about 500 years after the birth of Christ. If you open a textbook, it will say that Christ was born in the first year of the Common Era, or before the Common Era, at the beginning of the Common Era. That's why it's called Anno Domini, or in the year of our Lord. And the date of Christ's birth was calculated by the monk Denis the Small in the 6th century AD, over 500 years later. This means that for 500 years, the Christian Church lived calmly, not knowing and not being interested. Parishioners didn't know when Christ lived. In the 3rd, 2nd, and 4th centuries, they didn't know. And yet they didn't disperse. They didn't think that if they didn't know it, their faith was wrong. When Denis the Small calculated it, not everyone accepted it. In the Catholic Church, it was accepted only in the 15th century. This calculation from the 6th century became widely accepted in the 15th century. For 100 years, not everyone accepted it. Who accepted it, who didn't, it's an obscure story. And it's only from the 15th century, as is believed, that it became universally accepted. In Constantinople in the 15th century, they were still debating the date of Christ's birth and came to no conclusion, deciding that it was unknown. I'm presenting this from the perspective of historians. There is a Russian catechism from the 17th century, or rather, Church Slavonic. The Great Catechism, a huge thick book, meticulously describes all the theological principles of orthodoxy related to Christ, but there is no date of Christ's birth there. It's absent throughout the entire thick book. Why is that? Because the people who compiled this catechism understood perfectly well that the date is not a dogma. You can think one way or another, but it's not related to the dogmas of the Christian Church. However, today, due to the fact that people who occupy positions in the ecclesiastical hierarchy, regardless of whether it's the Orthodox Church, the Catholic Church, Jewish rabbis, or certain Buddhist leaders, they all went to school. They were all taught the same chronological version from childhood. And since they have this one version in their minds, it starts to merge with their beliefs. Like anyone in their place, it becomes difficult for them to differentiate these things and understand that some pertain to belief, while others are scientific discoveries, calculations. It can be correct, or it can be incorrect. When you tell a person that Christ was not born 2,000 years ago, but less than 800 and something, and he says, well, then the Christian Church is wrong. How can this be? If it's been 2,000 years, then the Christian Church has the right to exist, but if it's 800, then no. It's very difficult to explain that in reality, it's the opposite. Because if the Christian Church has existed for 2,000 years since Christ, and at the same time, the chronology is accurate, then it turns out that some ancient pagans were celebrating Christian holidays. How did they have this knowledge? This was a blow to the heart of the Christian Church, dealt in the 19th century. This is because it directly identified sacred history with Scaliger's history. It did not resist Scaliger's history, which for the Christian Orthodox Church, as well as for Christianity in general, not just Orthodoxy, and even for the Catholic Church, is a dagger to the heart. In reality, Scaliger's chronology logically contradicts Christianity. This is because it's known that many Christian holidays and concepts existed in certain communities which, according to historians, were before Christ. So, what does this all lead to? It leads to the idea that Christianity is a literary composition that someone put together by drawing from various beliefs of ancient peoples and composed the Gospels. There was actually nothing there. It's all a literary creation. This viewpoint emerges from Scaliger's chronology. Whether we like it or not, it logically follows. We can close our eyes to it, bury our heads in the sand, but it follows. Still, the majority of people don't bury their heads in the sand. Therefore, consider the influence the Christian Church had in the mid-19th century before this was discovered, before all these pre-Christian ancient depictions of ancient peoples were found. And when they were found, around the middle of the 19th century, and this information was integrated into society, the Christian Church began losing its positions. It kept losing, and what has it turned into now? Scaliger's chronology is just poison for it. But the first ones who oppose the new chronology from a religious perspective are Christians. They will be the first to say, "How can you do this? You are offending the feelings of believers." We are believers ourselves. I am personally a believer, and we are not offending the feelings of believers. On the contrary, one might say we are defending them, if you will. We don't have the goal of defending them, but it has turned out this way. But if it has turned out this way, then we are defending them. Because we are engaged in science, we do not interfere in theology at all. We do not challenge any theological foundations. Neither Judaism, nor Islam, nor Buddhism. We do not challenge any religious theories. We are exclusively focused on sacred history, which, as it turns out, is connected in all belief systems. In Christianity, in Buddhism, in Islam, in Judaism. From this, does it follow that any of these belief systems are wrong? No. These are completely dissimilar things. So, whoever believes in whatever can continue to believe in it. But if I were to address Christians specifically, as my fellow believers, since I am also a Christian, I would like to address you. Consider what aligns with Christianity and what does not. When you criticize the new chronology, in fact, you are criticizing yourselves. Think about that.
Gleb Vladimirovich, thank you very much for this meeting and for the detailed and interesting discussion.
Svetlana, I am grateful to you and grateful to the Museum of the New Chronology for organizing such meetings. And I want to address our readers and people who are generally interested in history, with the message to come to the museum. Creating such a museum is actually a tremendous endeavor. Anatoly Fomenko and I, we never even imagined it could be possible. This is a very good museum that allows you to understand the true nature of our history in just a few hours. Can you imagine how much effort and time it takes to understand this by reading books? Here, you can grasp it in a matter of hours, and then delve into the details. It's a wonderful museum, and I invite everyone to Yaroslavl, to this museum. We have been there many times ourselves and have always been impressed.
Dear viewers, starting this month, the schedule for our programs will change. In order not to miss new meetings with the authors of the new chronology, subscribe to our channel and visit the Multimedia Museum of the New Chronology in Yaroslavl. See you soon.